Welcome back again to our sessions. And for this, we have the second featured speaker session by Professor Mahmud Hasan Khan. And for this session, we have Dr. Asifa Sultana, professor at the Department of English and Humanities, BRAC University, Bangladesh. I will now hand over the stage to Professor Asifa Sultana for introducing the featured speaker and also to give introduction about the session. Please welcome Dr. Asifa Sultana.
Thank you, everyone. I welcome you to this featured speaker session 2. Now, our featured speaker is Dr. Mahmud Hasan Khan. He is Professor, Department of English and Humanities, University of Liberal Arts, Bangladesh. His talk is titled Language and Being, the Relevance of Ngugi, Thiong'o, and Heidegger in Ethnomethodology. So this is home ground for Mahmud Hasan Khan, but I'll do the conference ritual. I'll have to introduce him briefly. Mahmud Hasan Khan, PhD, is a discourse analyst. He teaches sociolinguistics and language policy in education. He taught at ULAB and IUB in Bangladesh and earlier at the University of Malaya in Malaysia. He was also the executive director of Sashin Center for Multilingual Excellence at IUB. So the center focused mainly on documenting and studying indigenous languages in the Chittagong Hill Tracts, Bangladesh. Professor Khan is one of the editors of the Routledge Handbook of English Language Education in Bangladesh. He has published in the areas of identity formation and policy discourses. His recent publications include chapters in Routledge and Springer on medium of instruction, equity, and social justice. I now welcome Professor Mahmud Hasan Khan to give us his featured speech. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Asifa, for the kind introduction. So I will try to limit my talk in 25 to 27 minutes because I know my slot is like 30 minutes. So I'll try to limit my talk in 25 to 27 minutes. So I'll straight away go to my talk. As you see, the title is Language and Being, the Relevance of Ngugi, Thiong'o, and Martin Heidegger in Ethnomethodology. The focus of today's seminar is Ngugi. However, I must acknowledge that my knowledge of Ngugi is quite limited in comparison to most of my colleagues present today, who have in-depth knowledge of Ngugi's work, literary criticism, and theories. I study mundane, everyday language in context as people make sense of their language use in everyday life. In today's seminar, I will focus on the place of language in ethnomethodology and conversation analysis, followed by a discussion on the ways Heidegger and Ngugi understood this phenomenon we call language. I'll start with an example of a very minute social action in a specific context. The social action that I'm going to start with is pre-offer. Pre-offer occurs in a context where an offer proper comes next. This is an example from Emanuel Shegloff. If you look at the example, in this conversation we see 3 participants, Kathy, Leslie, and Gary, in a bookstore, quite an unusual place to expect a thermometer from. Kathy, a mother, needs the thermometer to check her daughter's temperature. Gary, a fellow employee, does not simply offer the thermometer after Kathy has articulated the need for one in line 1. The offer itself is preceded by a pre-offer, which takes the form of a mention of its availability in line 4. I produced this example just to show that our conversations are semiotically rich, they are never chaotic, and through a precise transcription of conversational data, we can show how our conversations are structured procedurally. Also to highlight that people do use language structurally, procedurally, to carry out social actions like an offer. From the example, we learn that conversation develops through turns in pairs. We call them adjacency pairs, as they are adjacent to each other. And ideally, only one person should be speaking in each turn. One should be able to continue with their turn construction units without any obstacle. Overlap occurs, as we find in lines 1 to 4. Turns are distinctly visible through first pair part and second pair part. Let me position myself first. I have been doing discourse analysis for many years, and I started reading about ethnomethodology and conversation analysis only recently, say around 2015. From a disciplinary perspective, we can put both conversation and discourse analysis under the broader umbrella of sociolinguistics, the study of language and society, where the focus is to explain the dialectical relation between language and society, how language shapes the society and in turn is shaped by it. We cannot deny that for a better understanding of each element, i.e. language and society, we need different epistemological tools, tools to explain language structures, and tools to analyze social composition. We must be able to see language as a linguistic phenomenon and society as a sociological phenomenon. However, for sociolinguists, ethnomethodologists, and conversationalists who view linguistic act from the perspective of language as a social action, that would require the analyst to produce a social analysis of language, that is, offer an analysis of the language bit against its specific context of use. Conversation analysis, to give a brief background, was born in the Department of Sociology, not linguistics, with Harvey Sachs, Emanuel Shegloff, and Gail Jefferson at UCLA campus and UC Irvine campus in the US. Sachs and his gang wanted to explain how members of a society, through various institutions of that society, like family, school, hospital, police, and so on, continue to make sense of what a society is in lay terms. Sachs wanted to record how ordinary members of a language community play society ordinarily, play what Wittgenstein called language games. Sachs and his colleagues, those conversationalists, relied heavily on a novel interpretation of sociology initiated by Harold Garfinkel, who named it ethnomethodology. What is ethnomethodology? Or what do ethnomethodologists do? According to Garfinkel, ethnomethodologists study the objective reality of social facts. Two things here: objective reality and social facts. The reality understood objectively is actually how members understand, interpret, and construct reality as a shared phenomenon. It is not merely understanding by an individual. For instance, members acknowledge a greeting as a greeting objectively, socially as a shared custom, not as an individual phenomenon. Culture-specific greetings like "G'day mate," "Sudah makan," "Salam alaikum," or "Assalamu alaikum," and so on can be individualized but cannot be stretched too much. And individual idiosyncratic expressions of greeting will always be filtered through society in which that greeting is produced. That is, although we find variation as individuals carry out these activities in a range of ways, ethnomethodologists would tell you that there is a limit to variation. Try greeting in a non-normative way and see what happens. Graphical students often ran experiments to see what happens when we break norms. They named the experiment breaching experiment just to see puzzle faces or to establish the fact that norms exist. So we get the theorem that there are norms, and these norms can be bent only to a certain extent by using what I would call Goldilocks principle. Garfinkel also believed social facts are not based on entirely some fixed, rigid, pre-given rules. And as not being fixed entities, they are constructs. Members do make sense of theirs and others' activities through trial and error. If social facts were entirely pre-given, members would not have that opportunity to innovate, create, and exercise their agency as reflective members to rewrite the social script of greeting a person in the street or haggle for a better deal at a fish seller's. Members reinvent ways of doing things all the time, and through minute, step-by-step procedural action, they would show what they are doing. If we want to explain, say, rejection as a procedural achievement, we can show the process accordingly. Here's an example of how rejections can be made, or I'm not going to say rejections are made because there are no like fixed ways of doing things. People will always find their ways to reject by not stretching it too much. Members have a general understanding of how to reject or say no. Structurally, a request is made in the first pair part of a request, and acceptance or rejection comes in the second pair part. Members know that responding with an yes is always shorter. They also know that some no's are shorter and others long, and that the script of rejection varies across contexts. You can compare how the length of saying no to people vary based on where one stands in relation to power, sharing with the interlocutor. Rule following or breaking norms are not always entirely linguistic activities. Say how much of someone's body should be bent while greeting a person has little to do with language the way we understand it. But that bending of the body is semiotically rich. Gestures and postures are not linguistic acts, but these extra-linguistic or paralinguistic elements are necessary materials for ordinary members to box verbal language, often representing knowledge of do's and don'ts in a culture, setting, or context of a talking interaction. So we have shown that construction of social facts relies both on linguistic and extra-linguistic activities. Putting it metaphorically, one can say these different linguistic features are inherently laminated, combined together as if they are one entity to make a talk-in interaction an example of talk-in interaction. Social facts as constructs are accomplishments as members in a specific context, and as such, all actions are situated action. Ethnomethodologists would focus on what is it that is going on here, as American sociologist Irving Goffman would also put it this way to explain his work. For ethnomethodologists, the fundamental task of sociology is to study social facts as how they are, I know it's like Can you read? Every society is locally, endogenously produced, naturally organized, naturally accountable, ongoing, practical achievement, being everywhere, always, only, exactly, and entirely members' work. Vulgarly competent members of a social group can follow the rules or norms because these norms are loosely shared by all who consider themselves as members. Through those examples of pre-offer, as I have shown before, and rejection, we have shown that it is possible to list the steps followed by these members as they produce, display, and demonstrate what observably the case in hand is. The analysts treat each observable element in the context of an interaction as contributive elements to get to the meaning of the observed phenomena without exhausting both linguistic and contextual variables. One cannot understand or interpret what is it that is going on here. What is someone doing by talking in a certain way, and often by not talking. The conversational part is juggled with contextual variables tirelessly in a talking interaction that becomes obvious as they interact, as they make instructively observable local indigenous production of social facts. Members uphold the society by doing things including classifying or categorizing their activities, and they also leave a template for future members to continue or, if necessary, radicalize the content of the observable, accountable texts. Now I come to Heidegger. Now, producing an account occupies a specific place in Martin Heidegger, a philosopher. I usually read Heidegger as a sociologist. So a philosopher comes sociologist as he offers concepts like understanding, assertion, articulation, and language to describe his project. Heidegger believed that understanding of an articulation relies on the greater horizon against which an articulation is made, enframed. He refers to this horizon as discourse. For him, I quote from Being and Time, discourse is the articulation of intelligibility. That is, what is intelligible to us, what we understand and express as a proof of our understanding, is an articulation in a linguistic form coming from a perspective. The name of that perspective is discourse. Discourse for Heidegger includes both linguistic and extra-linguistic elements. It also includes what is present and what is absent, almost in the manner of explicit signifiers available for current analysis and signifiers read as palimpsest. More than anything else, for Heidegger, any articulation must be viewed as attempts to interpret social facts by beings in the world based on their overall understanding of something at hand. Integral to understanding and interpretation is the phenomenon of assertions. Understanding, interpretations, articulation, and assertions are basic revelatory ways of beings in the world. Garfinkel, the ethnomethodologist, who felt that ethnomethodology needs a Heideggerian turn, would define these revelatory ways as members' ways of doing things. Social facts, expressed as assertions, can be structured as such and can be communicated as such and such to others. The interpretation and articulation of social facts as such and such is given in a language as an act of interpretation of a social fact, is also an act of signifying against certain background. So what Heidegger is trying to tell us is that, I quote a reader of Heidegger, Demolling, linguistic meaning depends upon our practical dealings with things in the world and our social relations, by means of which those meaningful structures and referential connections through which we come to an understanding of the world are generated. This understanding is articulated in and through discourse. My last remark on Heidegger comes from my reading of his letter on humanism. In this piece, Heidegger gave thinking a superior place to language or discourse. We hear him saying, it is through thinking that beings come to language. But how can you think without language? When he says intelligibility may not be captured entirely in linguistic assertions, I go to language philosophers, Ludwig Wittgenstein, who said, the limits of my language mean the limits of my world. I understand Heidegger better when he says, language is the house of being. In its home, human beings dwell. Those who think and those who create with words are the guardians of this home. Their guardianship accomplishes the manifestation of being insofar as they bring this manifestation to language and preserve it in language through their saying. Heidegger always oscillated between making something sound ontic and ontological. He cannot help going beyond precise, specific ontic assertions, ending up claiming that, I quote, the liberation of language from grammar into a more original essential framework is reserved for thought and poetic creation. Thinking is l'engagement, engagement by and for the truth of being. Now, we all know that the lived experiences that provided Martin Heidegger and Ngũgĩ or Thiong'o the fodder for thinking about the world were radically different. One can say that for Heidegger, the only language that could capture being ontologically in its essence is creative writing, like poetry. While everyday language, he claims, captures thought. So for him, what was more important was the primacy of thought that might or might not be translated into language. Similar to what we see in Chomsky's latent versus surface structure in his syntactic theory. Surface structure, surfaced as assertions, is just a possibility of what was there in the latent structure. On the other hand, for Ngũgĩ, the language for articulation must be the mother tongue for any native African to articulate his being both ontically and ontologically. Nothing can enter the thought machine of an oppressed soul without a native language. Let's reflect a bit more on how Ngũgĩ perceived language. In Decolonizing the Mind, Ngũgĩ remembers his life in the village as he was growing up, listening to stories in Gikuyu. I quote, language was not a mere string of words. It had a suggestive power well beyond the immediate and lexical meaning. We learned the music of our language on top of the content. The language, through images and symbols, gave us a view of the world, but it had a beauty of its own. The language of our evening teach-ins, and the language of our immediate and wider community, and the language of our work in the fields were one, end of quote. After this description of life in harmony with language, we get another description on how that harmony with mother tongue was broken for Ngũgĩ. He writes about how through the declaration of a state of emergency over Kenya in 1952, made all the schools under district education boards in English, which were hitherto run by patriotic nationalists. In Kenya, Ngũgĩ felt English turned into something that was more than a language, as everyone had to acknowledge its superior status. Ngũgĩ believed that, and I quote, to write for, speak for, and work for the lives of peasants and workers was the highest call of national duty. My only regret was that, for many years, I had wandered in the bourgeois jungle and the wilderness of foreign cultures and languages. Kamiritu was my homecoming, end of quote. Ngugi was born in the village of Kamiritu in Kenya. Many of us would find this description very nostalgic, almost like lines from a Bollywood film, say Amir Khan's Swadeshi. He continues in his Swadeshi spirit, and I quote, "Let me tell you something else. You people, even if you follow Europeans to the grave, they will never let you really know their languages. They will never, and mark my words, Europeans will never let you into the secrets held by their languages. What do you then become? They are slaves." End of quote. Now, the world has changed a lot since the 1960s and 70s. We live in a world where we meet multilingual people every now and then. When studies on bilingual first language acquisition, that is how children learn 2 or more languages simultaneously from the time of its birth, are aplenty. Hence, many would say Ngugi is too parochial here against our today's increasingly multilingual global world. Upon hearing his Swadeshi speeches, one may fall into the trap of dismissing him in lieu of contextualizing him. We must understand that Ngugi was referring to the status of specific languages, like English, Gikuyu, and Kiswahili, and their use in specific site meant for a specific people from a specific time. He was fighting against a bunch of goons as they robbed him of his mother tongue, his Gikuyu. He was in that classic context of Ora amar mukher bhasha kaira nibar chaye. Ngugi was not just trying to save Gikuyu. He imagined an Africa where all languages are equal in their differences. We cannot essentialize Ngugi as a narrow Swadeshi, also because we hear his justification for writing in English. He says, I quote, "English was a foreign language, but it was an important language in the history of Kenya." End of quote. So Ngugi was not against English as a mere language. He was after its superior status. What Ngugi did through his activism and his creative and critical writing was to keep questioning the Eurocentric articulation or interpretation of Africa. He showed how racism, more than anything else, was a linguistic product. To explain Ngugi's rage, 2 concepts can be helpful here: dismembering and remembering. For Ngugi, creative imagination is one of the greatest remembering practices articulated by dismembered beings and marginalized bodies. It is important to underline that to question the linguistic processes involved in dismembering, Ngugi celebrated African languages for remembering. What we need to learn from Ngugi is then, in pursuing one's radical goals, one should not be craving for official patronage. By choosing to write in Gikuyu and asking others to write in African languages, he took a personal position to question the superior status of imperial or European languages. He was full of rage because he saw how the colonial authorities dispossessed African people of their land, labor, body, and mind, as he writes about it in his Moving the Center. For him, writing in native tongue, remembering or decoloniality becomes the only solution against centuries of suffering through coloniality or dismemberment. Now, how do we translate his rage in Bangladeshi context? Particularly for those ones who believe that they are fighting against English, fighting against some sort of Anglophonic aggression. One of the recent fads in the academia to fight against such aggression has popularly been labeled as translanguaging. My position vis-a-vis translanguaging is that the translanguagers are not with Ngugi. And they are not with him for several reasons. Firstly, the translanguagers want to be recognized by the colonizers. I feel their project is assimilationist. Boro hoye ekdin shada hobo ami. The current new liberal project of turning English medium kids into appropriate human capital is based on the idea that contemporary half-baked English medium education will be benefited immensely if they incorporate translanguaging. Second, translanguaging experts in Bangladesh do not have an answer for those who are fighting against local language hegemonies, like the students from CHT for whom Bangla is a second and English is a third or fourth language. I'm afraid they don't have an answer for English medium kids either who find formal education. They are like formal academic Bangla kind of alienating. Translanguaging is considered being the only solution in the classroom. Another group ignored are students with strong background in Arabic, graduating from madrasas, as many of them also suffer language loss by being descaled using Blomar's terms. So translanguaging practices in Bangladeshi context needs to be radicalized further to be Ngugian if by any chance that is their goal. In its current form, translanguaging activism supports the neoliberal education industry simply by spreading temporary ointment on students' linguistic wounds. If we want to accommodate learners' mother tongues in the name of translanguaging researchers need to expand their language list exactly the way it was imagined by Ngugi in the context of Africa. I think I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Mahmud Hasan Khan. Thank you for the insights and drawing the connections between Ngugi and Heidegger's work. What I understand from the talk is that Heidegger looks at language as a sociological phenomena, while Ngugi uses more of a cultural lens to language. Unfortunately, we won't have time for a question-answer session. So, but I would like to close this session by pointing out that although both Heidegger and Ngugi put different lenses to language, but as Professor Khan points out, that they both found some common grounds in language as the house of being. So I thank you all for staying with us in this session, and thank you, Professor Mahmud Hasan Khan, for the wonderful talk.
May I request both the featured speaker and the session chair to please remain on stage, please. Before we move on to our next session, I would like to invite our head of department, Ms. Arifa Ghani Rahman, to present a token of appreciation. First to our featured speaker, Professor Dr. Mahmud Hasan Khan. And next to our session chair, Professor Dr. Asifa Sultana.